Hey everybody, it's Jason Blah here. Now that my two obligatory informative videos are done for the day, it's time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And some of my subscribers have awared me of a video that OmarIsuf did about back training, but it ended up being about rear delts. And I'm someone who I used to like Omar, used to like a lot of what he's done in the past, not so much the direction he's going today. So let's talk about the problems in this video. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on scaling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. You know, Omar went into all this talk about rear delts and isolating the rear delts and all of that. And I'm sorry guys, but some basic common sense and looking at physiology should tell you you can't isolate the rear delts. The posterior head of the deltoid cannot be isolated. And granted, it's impossible to isolate a muscle anyways. We know this already. That's kind of a bodybuilding idea. It's not even called isolation work in the research for a reason. It's called single joint versus multi-joint because you can't actually isolate a muscle. But as far as that goes, the rear delts are even less isolatable than most muscles in the body. And the fact is that he's talking about putting all this work into taking other muscles out of the equation so that the rear delts can do like half of the work, which, you know, is a tough call. To even get them to do 50% of the moving is very, very, very difficult, almost impossible. But to try to get it to that point, that should tell you something. That this is not a muscle that your body is intended to attempt to use by itself. It can't. It always brings other muscles in to accept more than half of the load unless you are excessively obsessive about trying to use just the rear delt. Right, so that should tell you something about its function. In other words, it's not intended to be used this way. And in fact, rear delts, quite frankly, don't lag because people don't isolate them. They usually lag because people just don't train their entire upper back enough. Right, that's the problem. It has to do with people being interior dominant because they do excessive amounts of pressing and not enough pulling with enough volume, and they're disproportionately strong. But what's interesting is that, you know, he's getting into all this fluff and pump now. And you guys know what are the three categories of fitness that we really need to be leery of. The three categories of nonsense and bullshit are the fluff and pump, then we got leapfrog and grab ass, and then we have titty jiggle fitness, right? That's our three categories. And you know, you guys should be able to look at those names and figure out kind of what I'm talking about. But this falls under kind of fluff and pump. This whole idea of attempting to isolate muscles and use very, very small controlled movements for very, very high reps for them in an attempt to bring them up. And I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on our weak points. Even for me as a non-bodybuilder, but even for me as an athlete, I will admit there is merit to attempting to bring up weak points. Look, if you have a muscle that needs more work for whatever reason, I don't care whether your goals are aesthetic or athletic or whatever your purpose is, it makes sense to do extra work for that. I'm not saying you shouldn't do extra work for something that you know isn't proportionate. Because let's be realistic here. Even for athletes, disproportionate muscles cause what? They can cause injuries. They can cause you to get hurt. Like, it's not desirable. And the whole concept of the whole classic aesthetics came from what is an athletically functional body, right? That's the idea. When you get someone who has well-balanced musculature, which again is better for sports in general if you don't want to get hurt, because again, everything can load everything evenly. You've got proper support of all the joints because of different muscles pulling in the right proportions and things. It's in good stability. It's a good idea to be proportionate, right? I mean, coaches understand this. Strength coaches understand this. And then when those people dieted down lean enough, if they were proportionate, it creates that idea of classic aesthetics. That's where it comes from. So I'm not going to knock that even from a function perspective. So, I mean, if you've got something that needs more work, then by all means train more. If your triceps are lagging, then train your triceps. That's fine. You know, if your delts are lagging, then do more shoulder work. I have no issue with that. The problem we get into, though, is this sort of nonsense that people really think that rear delts are a common lagging problem because people don't isolate them. Well, the reality is not only is the rear delt not isolatable, and it's a very, very small muscle, but the fact that we don't have one single shred of credible evidence in comparison to the larger body of works that even suggests that isolating a muscle makes it grow faster. In other words, every single study that's compared single joint versus multi-joint exercises have found that when workloads are similar, multi-joint exercises produce just as much muscle mass than a single joint does. In fact, we've got studies now looking at different demographics all the way down from ranked novices up to scholarship athletes, showing that lat pull downs make your biceps grow just as fast as curls do if you do the same reps and sets. So if you do 3 sets of 10 all lat pull downs to failure, you get the exact same muscle growth in your bicep as if you do concentration curls to failure. There's no difference. There's no difference in the research when it's been measured. So what does that tell you? That isolating muscles doesn't seem to do anything other than help bring up a lagging muscle. So in other words, that would make sense to do that if the other muscles are disproportionately large. So you get into something like the rear delts. Well, the rear delt might be disproportionate to the front delt and the side delt, but if the side delt is very rare, isn't it? Usually people who have lagging rear delts, a lot of times the side head of their delt is also not proportionate. And they're just interior dominant because they do way too much benching, or even their idea of overhead pressing tends to be interior dominant because they do it seated at an angle and just turn it into a high incline. But truth be told, how many people have you guys ever seen in your life not looking at competitive bodybuilding, because competitive bodybuilders inject their rear delts? Okay, so they're full of stuff. They're injecting them. So you set that to the side, but have you guys ever seen anyone who has big side delts and big thick lats who has no rear delts? Like, does that really exist? Does it really exist? I mean, is that something you see all the time? Not really. Now, it might be big front delts, but usually if you see someone who has well-developed side delt and a well-developed thick back, their rear delts are big also. And I mean, Omar's a perfect example. I'm not saying Omar doesn't have decent back development, but Omar doesn't have a massive back. Right? Omar doesn't have a massive back. You guys have seen my back. His back's a lot smaller than mine. So by a lot of standards, Omar's back itself, which is surprising. You know, I always tell people deadlifts will actually give you a pretty big back. Omar actually has a surprisingly underdeveloped back considering what he can pull. So I'm actually kind of surprised at that. So if he's sitting here, he's worried about his rear delts, I would say, you know, start doing some rows. Do more rows. Do more pull-ups. Now, we could argue that rows do work the rear delts a little better than pull-ups do. That's subject to debate. But, you know, first thing I would say to these people is that, have you guys ever seen anyone who can do pen lay rows with 275 for reps? Right? Pen lays, like do 5 reps, clean reps with 275, and who can press 200 plus. And by the press, I mean the strict standing press. You ever seen anybody who can do both of those who has no rear delts? Of course not. Of course not. Because the strict standing press done correctly works the rear delts a lot more than most other overhead work does. Right? It's a fact. What about pen lay rows? Pen lay rows are an absolute powerhouse for the rear delts, because the thing is, you can talk about all you want of, well, trying to do this. Look, if you have scapular retraction, which he's trying to tell people not to do, just to do the rear delts with no scapular retraction, right? You're not removing the function of the rear delt. Just because you're getting more lat and mid-trap involved doesn't mean the rear delts are not working. That is completely absurd. And anyone who tells you that the rear delts are suddenly not working because those muscles are getting involved is full of shit. That is biomechanically impossible. Now, if you're cheating and swinging, right, let's say you're using a lot of body English to swing up some sort of face pull or rear delt row or whatever it is you're trying to do, okay, maybe, because you're removing all the muscles, but you're also using less lat. You're using less of all of that at that point because you're just cheating the weight up and then you're just trying to catch it on the eccentric. Okay, that's arguable, but someone who's pulling relatively strictly on any sort of row or pull or face pull or anything else, you're telling me the rear delts are not getting worked heavily? Of course they are. That the person who has the lagging rear delts usually doesn't have very thick lats either, right? 9 times out of 10, their lats are undersized also, in proportion. So what I would say to most people, get stronger on your rows, get stronger on your pull-ups, get stronger on your strict standing press, right? Get strong at all those lifts and your rear delts are going to grow. They are absolutely going to grow. But, you know, push come to shove, let's say that you feel like they still need some extra work. And I can see that, guys. I mean, you don't want weak rear delts. If you want to have a good, stable bench press and stay injury-free on the bench press, I'm one of the first people to say, hey, having strong rear delts is a benefit to you, right? Having well-developed rear delts will help stabilize your shoulder joint better. It's not a bad idea. Band face pulls. Like if all else fails, if your rear delts are not growing enough and you're rowing an enormous amount of weight with strict form, you're doing the press correctly and getting the bar behind your head at the top with good form, with a good heavy weight, and you still feel your rear delts are lagging behind a little bit, band face pulls are your fix. You don't need anything special about it. Go look at the data on it. Look at the data that Brett Contreras had on with the EMG studies, and I'm not saying those are the be-all end-all, but look at his data on the band face pull. It worked the side delt and the rear delt just as much as isolating them did. Right? It was near the top of activation for both of those, in addition to having other benefits. But it doesn't isolate it, and it is, again, probably the single best rear delt exercise found, at least in any of the EMG data, and it's still a multi-joint exercise that has other benefits. Because at the end of the day, what I would say to people is, in what world would you want only your rear delt to grow? Like, seriously, who has time to waste 15 minutes of your training every week on a silly ass tiny little muscle like that? If you could go ahead and make it grow and go ahead and work your rotator cuffs and your side delt and your traps and everything else at the same time, that would be the smartest thing you could do. That's what I would recommend. Okay, fine, you need something else because that area is lagging. Do some band face pulls. Problem solved. But attempting to isolate the rear delts is quite frankly impossible, absurd, and a complete waste of time. It's not based on reality. It's not based upon the evidence of how muscles get activated, how muscles grow, and particularly what you can even physically do with that muscle. That muscle was never intended to be attempted to isolate by your body. Your body is completely resistant to that for a reason. That's why it is so difficult to even try to not get the other muscles involved with it, because it's not intended. It doesn't have a function that allows for this to happen. That's not the purpose of that muscle. It gets used in an enormous number of exercises. The problem is that people just aren't strong enough on those basic exercises. They're not doing enough workload on them, other than a few exceptions. And like I said, if that is the case, just a band face pull. Easy solution, done. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.